Hi, and welcome back to my series on literature and stories. I've rearranged the playlist a little bit, but really, as I've noted in my introduction video and stuff like that, the goal is for me to write my meta theory of sociological concepts and how societies develop. In doing so, I'm studying Campbellian theory, as well as Jung and a few other concepts, and integrating that into a more cohesive social work perspective. And so I'm going through a few different things. And so each week I'm discussing stories and literature in this thread. Every Monday there should be a new video coming out talking about stories and trying to dissect some of the themes of them so that I can integrate those ideas into my book. And so today I wanted to talk about Altered Carbon, which was a really fascinating read. Of course, like most people, I watched the Netflix show. It really piqued my curiosity. I picked up the book. The book was far better. They definitely changed stuff for the TV show, but I found the book to be really depth-filled. I want to focus more on the book than the show, but regardless, I think that there was some really, really interesting stuff in here. So what's at the center point of this story is a simple philosophical question, which is, what is the self? And this is a classic question that philosophers have dealt with for a very, very, very long time, right? There's been this constant discussion about what that is and how do we define that and how do we understand it. And that's complicated even today, right? Ancient Greek philosophers asked about a boat, right? I believe they were talking about maybe the Argonaut, right? Jason and his crew, but I could be mistaken there. And the question was, if the boat leaves dock, it goes on a quest, right? It goes on a journey. And throughout that journey, the crew changes, right? At each port, somebody leaves, somebody new comes on, and it receives damage, right? There's bumps and bruises, and it hits rocks, after it plays wood and things like that. At what point does it cease being the Argonaut? If when it returns, there's an entirely new crew, is it a different ship? If when it returns, it's an entirely new ship in terms of material, if every board has been replaced, if every nail, every bit of material has been replaced with a new one, is it the same ship? Well, that's a really complicated question to answer. This is also true for the self, right? From what we understand from biology and basic anatomy of the body, every cell in the body, every part of who you are has died, right? The cells in my body have all died multiple times and been completely replaced. I am a cumulative mix of new cells. I'm an entirely new being. Every brain cell, every organ cell, every part of my being has been replaced over the last decade and the decade before that. Am I the same me that I was when I was born? If the answer is yes, then how so? And this is something that Altered Carbon takes to another level, with the idea of a sleeve, right? So if the human body is purely a arbitrary mechanic for hosting the mechanism of the self, we've now further diluted the question of what is the self. So from the gate of that, what this book is asking is where does that self reside? Is there an inherent soul or an inherent set of memory? And what makes it a very neo-punk, cyberpunk concept is this idea that the self is nothing but data. It's nothing but a backup. It's a OneDrive file. It's something that we store on box. It is a flash drive, which is a very interesting idea. Now, and one I don't know if I necessarily agree with, but the concept is that the self is at the core here, something that is mechanical and mathematical, is a series of ones and zeros. It is the cumulative experience and saved data file of overlaying information Now, this creates a complication, which the show also addresses, the book also addresses. Woken Furies, the third book, I believe, gets into it a little bit more. This idea, what happens when we start booting it back up? And now there's multiple versions of the self spun out of separate concepts. It's a hard question to answer. This is something that philosophers and psychologists have been trying to figure out, I mean, since the dawn of our science, and have not been able to come to a real answer for. Beyond that, it plays with the idea of artificial intelligence. In the show, it's Poe. In the book, this is Hendrix, but takes a bit of a lesser role. And honestly, I actually think this is, while the book was significantly better, I think across the board, I do believe Poe was probably a better character than Hendrix, and I think fit better, at least with that type of noir theme that I felt really fit the work. But this idea of what if the self is a series of data, if it is a cumulative developed mechanical concept that can be downloaded and inputted into various skins, what separates an artificially created one? Where is that line? And we see these AIs to be very real structures with very real emotional responses, right? I mean, they're programmed to need the guest, which I find very interesting, right? I mean, humans aren't that different. We have our own base programming. This might be evolutionary, or this may from a creation of some sort, whatever philosophy you subscribe to in this regard. But humans have base necessary drives that motivate our behavior in the same way the AI does. So then that begs the question of what makes us that different. Well, that's really difficult to answer. But one that's a very important question if we're going to make a sociological theory that premises on how the self develops and how the self fits in society and how the society develops as a result. And where does the self come in? So I go back to some evolutionary psychology and biological themes, and I think what makes this really complicated is the idea of consciousness is not as concrete as we typically want it to be. And I think Altered Carbon, yet again, deals with that issue, but the idea of consciousness is very abstract, which is a term I use a lot in the book. But consciousness is an evolutionary tool. It's this separate layer. And I sometimes like to think of like, I am this complete self. But the reality is we actually have so many base fundamental components of our existence that permeate outside of our consciousness. You do not control your heartbeat. Cells accidentally move to other parts of the body and try to grow a new organ and develop into cancers, even though you don't want them to. The body digests foods incorrectly and has, I mean, fear, all of these, there's these base mechanisms that are completely devoid of your consciousness. This is the primitive instinctual being. And consciousness is a tool to interact with the world that is separate from the individual's base being. And we see different gears of that with different animals, right? I mean, a dog has a higher level of consciousness than that of a plant. An elephant has a higher level of consciousness than that of a squirrel. And a human tends to have one of the highest level consciousness that we can see. Now, the question that is begged out of that is what runs the ship? What is the captain? Is consciousness the prime driver, or these base instinctual drives? The science is a little out on that. You know, there's been some very interesting studies looking at neurological responses and finding that the brain tends to come up with answers and responses to questions and challenges before the conscious is aware of it. Right? Now we're talking about the speed of light, fraction of milliseconds, but the brain is a very fast cross-factored system that is processing a significant amount of data that the consciousness is incapable of being aware of, nor would it be able to handle. Consciousness, the brain is constantly absorbing information from a vast swath of environmental factors that influence how we interact, right? I like to think about getting hungry, right? Like sometimes I crave a pickle, right? I want to go to my kitchen and grab a pickle. And the question is it because I want a pickle because I, Derek, like them? Or is it because my body has registered from environmental factors a certain threshold of salt necessity, various necessary other biological components that it needs to achieve certain goals in base mechanical formats that it then registers through my consciousness based off of cultural factors influenced by marketing that I need to go get a dill. Consciousness is a tool to achieve biological responses. So this is where I think the idea breaks from altered carbon. Right? The idea that you can completely separate that from the biology. And it toys with that a little bit, right? Kovacs takes on a new body and now all of a sudden has an addiction to nicotine that he has to deal with because the old sleep had that. And it's an idea I would like to see the book explore further. The idea of these base biological mechanical functions that impact consciousness, and how aware of those can we be? How divorced and separated can we be? And this is a really complicated question when we want to start discussing what is the soul? What is the essence of the being, and what can actually be separated, right? Descartes asks, what if I am just a separated brain being tortured by a demon? Philosophers have toyed with this, what the brain and the vat experience, right? A separated consciousness that's just being tortured. How capable is my existence without the biological components that interact with it? We have to be able to answer that if we want to discuss a psychological, sociological theory, because that biological component becomes a base necessity for understanding. So I think altered carbon plays with these questions in an interesting philosophical way, even in the text, right? The body is a culmination of carbon and various other elements that can be altered, influenced, and downloaded. It poses very interesting questions when it comes to space travel and things like that that are outside of my realm. So I think the next category for that is when we talk about the sociological questions it has to have. So now we have this idea of the self. But the next thing is it asks about classism, which is a very interesting and complicated issue, right? This idea of separate classes, accumulation of wealth, and individuals in a society that are able to perpetuate themselves, right? We call them meths in altered carbon. This group that's able to amass power and able to perpetuate it. When life becomes extended, which is a goal that most people will argue for. Very few people go, oh, we should shorten the human lifespan. Actually, on the contrary, most people, we want to extend that as long as possible. We want to give you the longest, best life possible. When we do that, the most wealthy and most powerful are able to perpetuate their wealth and power and use that to subvert other groups, which is another thing that the text plays with, right? We start seeing these other groups being greatly impacted by their inability to access the resources of those that have been able to greater accumulate. And so now it asks us the question of, if we are to extend life, how do we need to handle wealth inequality? I wish I had an answer for that. And that's something that I probably will not address in the book. But the reality there is that we need to understand that this is a complex issue that perpetuating can create significant problems, which I think that the book gives us some really good insight to. And I think I'll wrap up with that idea for right now and say on a simple note, I think this is a great read. This narrative, while it does not necessarily engage much of a hero's journey in a Campbellian sense, I think that's good. I get tired of that, right? I mean, the hero doesn't really change that much. And I don't know if he can. I think that's a part of the point. So with that being said, the questions that I am left with to answer as I try to write the book Circles Theory is, what is the self? And how do classist systems impact sociological structures? Yet again, I don't know if anybody will ever see these videos. And I don't know what scares me more, if no one will or if people will, right? I mean, it's a terrifying concept. But I'm going to start talking about stories in lit every single Monday. So be on the lookout. If you stumble upon this and this interests you, please check out the channel, check out the other videos. I have one of an outline of the book and all the concepts I'm going through, updating how I'm writing that and developing my sociological thesis and text, and videos discussing everything from mythology and folklore to media and film. So keep an eye out, and I will see you next Monday.